In July of 1979, a 17-year-old boy by the name of Sam Thornton boarded a plane from Western Australia, leaving his home country for the first time in his life. In his luggage was a small sandwich bag filled with 24 pieces of metal that he had found scattered around his home. His destination? San Francisco. His goal? Cash in on a $10,000 prize being offered by the San Francisco Examiner. The prize had been made by the Examiner to counter their rival paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, who had offered $200,000 if a subscriber of theirs had suffered personal or property damage. You see, what Sam Thornton had, and what had fallen on and around the garden shed of his mother's home, was Skylab, or rather, pieces of Skylab, America's first space station, which had burned up during atmospheric re-entry and rained down on the state of Western Australia in an international media event, and quite the embarrassment to NASA. Thornton collected his prize, at some chagrin to the Examiner's publisher, stating that he knew the pieces were from Skylab because he had, quote, just raked the yard the other day, and everyone in Australia had saw the station come down in a spectacular series of fireballs raining from the sky. Of course, it had not been NASA's plan to shower an inhabited area with pieces of molten metal, but to explain that, we need to rewind even further in time. Today, let's explore the history of NASA's first attempt at an orbiting laboratory, its problems, its achievements, its quirks, and its epic history. Let's take a walk down memory lane and tell the story of Skylab. The success of the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States had been finalized almost exactly 10 years before Stan Thornton collected his prize money. On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 touched down in the Sea of Tranquility on the Moon, making Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin the first human beings to set foot on the surface of the Moon. The space race was effectively over. Only 1 month after the landing, Nikolai Kamanin, head of the Soviet Cosmonaut Office, wrote in his journal that, quote, "We have lost our leadership in space." However, before any of this had even happened, NASA was already planning the next steps to follow the Apollo program. NASA had built up a lot of infrastructure to support Project Apollo. When the agency was established in 1958, they had a mere 8,000 employees and an annual budget of $100 million. They had 3 major research centers: Langley Aeronautical Laboratory, Ames Aeronautical Laboratory, and Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory, as well as 2 small test facilities. However, throughout the course of Projects Mercury and Gemini, and finally Project Apollo, NASA boomed quickly, creating a massive industry that employed nearly 500,000 people. Entire towns such as Huntsville, Alabama were completely transformed by the new space industry. Factories, testing facilities cropped up, expanded, and flourished. However, well before Project Apollo was finished, or even planned to be finished, much of that work would already be completed. Wernher von Braun, head of the Marshall Space Flight Center, had serious concerns about giving his employees and those linked to Apollo a reason to continue working. NASA had put a massive train on the tracks, and now von Braun and others had to quickly continue to build those tracks while the monster they created barreled toward its incomplete end. Thus, the Apollo Applications Program was born. Von Braun had, previously, proposed a large orbiting space station as a refueling and staging platform for spacecraft that would be headed to Mars, his goal to follow landing on the Moon. He envisioned a large 3-deck wheel-shaped station, 30 meters in diameter, which would rotate at a speed of 3 RPM, providing artificial gravity at 1/3 that of the Earth. It would have a crew of 80 people. However, the station was never attempted due to the sheer difficulty of constructing it, especially given the limited lifting capabilities of the United States and other nations at the time. Instead, to compensate for losing his lofty planned station, von Braun advocated for a smaller station that could be lofted into orbit with a single launch of his beloved Saturn V, with crew visiting it via the smaller Saturn 1B, keeping his employees and the engineers working for the foreseeable future. The Apollo Applications Program functioned in several phases. The first, known as the Apollo phase, would come to fruition beginning with the first lunar landing of Apollo 11 in 1969 and would continue until NASA felt the program had sufficient experience to proceed with the next phase, i.e. Apollo 14. Phase 2, the Lunar Exploration Phase, would then consist of 4 flights of the extended lunar module, which was modified to allow for longer duration stays on the lunar surface and perform more extensive scientific investigations while there. Following this, the final 2 phases would first survey the Moon for what they called ground truth sites, which would be the most ideal for a small, temporary lunar base, executed in the last phase. It It would utilize several pieces of hardware derived from the original Apollo LEM, as well as employ logistics vehicles such as advanced rovers and flyers to assist in assembly and work in these bases. Later, the AAP would also employ Apollo hardware for a manned flyby of the planet Venus, a joint US-Soviet mission that would eventually become the Apollo-Soyuz test project, and advanced space stations to facilitate later exploration of the outer planets. The AAP hoped to secure and retain a $1 billion budget for its operations in the 1968 fiscal year, keeping the factories, the workers, the engineers, the software devs, and everyone else who had come to rely on NASA for their livelihoods gainfully employed. However, the chopping block would come all too soon for both Project Apollo and the AAP in the form of the Johnson administration. Partly in order to implement his Great Society set of domestic programs while remaining within the proposed $100 billion budget, fiscal year 1967 allocated a measly $42 million to the Apollo Applications Program. This was in contrast to what NASA estimated was required for a full-scale AAP program, $450 million, increasing to the previously mentioned $1 billion the next year. With this severely slashed budget, practically the only thing to survive the death of the Apollo Applications Program would be the idea for a small space station. Skylab. In 1964, Wernher von Braun had different ideas for what he wanted Skylab to be. He proposed what was called a wet workshop to be built out of the S2, the second stage of the Saturn V rocket. The stage would be modified to be used as a living space, with much of the work to make it so already having been done before the launch. The Saturn V's first stage, or S1C, was far from capable of placing the lab into orbit on its own, so during launch, the S2 laboratory would function as a normal rocket stage, being filled with fuel and firing its engines to complete orbital insertion. The floor of the laboratory would be made of an open grid, allowing the fuel to pass through to the piping at the bottom of the tanks. Once safely in low Earth orbit, work begins. First, the S2 would be vented of any and all remaining propellant, and a large hatch at the top of the hydrogen tank would be opened. In place of an S4B, or third stage, was a cylindrical cargo module, which would then be hydraulically moved into the S2 tank. The tank would be resealed, pressurized with oxygen to form a living space, and accessed via that same hatch, now accessible by an Apollo Command and Service module that sat atop the entire rocket. The end result was quite the large laboratory, 33 by 45 feet or 10 by 14 meters, with power coming from solar cells lining the outside of the tank. The major problem with the wet workshop idea was the availability of the Saturn V. The concept required a dedicated rocket that could have its own second stage converted into a lab, and at the time, NASA simply didn't know if there would be any Saturn V's left after the Apollo moon landings. By the time the Apollo Applications Program began to receive its first round of funding, it was decided that there would not be enough. The Saturn V production lines would build just enough of the rockets for the moon missions alone. However, the pre-landing tests had actually gone far better than anticipated. Use of the Saturn 1B for low Earth orbit missions had been reduced significantly, and so what NASA did have a surplus of was that rocket. Now the wet workshop plan was passed to the third stage of the Saturn V, and the second stage of the Saturn 1B, the S4B. NASA and Skylab had a competitor a la the Department of Defense that became a major hurdle throughout much of its design phase, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. In December of 1963, NASA and the DoD agreed to cooperate in the construction of a space station, but the DoD got a little selfish. They wanted their own dedicated space station, primarily for orbital reconnaissance. They proposed the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL, a small station with the same diameter as the Titan II upper stage, its proposed launch vehicle. It would be launched into a polar orbit with the crew riding on top in a modified Gemini spacecraft with a hatch cut into its heat shield to allow for access into the station. The crew could work for up to 30 days before detaching the Gemini spacecraft and returning to Earth. For the next 5 years, the MOL would serve as Skylab's direct competitor for funding, while the MOL itself competed for funding with that of the ongoing Vietnam War. When Richard Nixon was elected president in 1969, the Bureau of the Budget and the Secretary of Defense were instructed to find ways to cut defense spending. Obviously, the MOL was at the top of many lists. It was regarded by many as superfluous, taking up $500 million a year in an era where spy satellites were becoming increasingly reliable and high resolution, making a manned reconnaissance station completely unnecessary. While there is a lot more that could be said on this subject, I didn't even mention the boilerplate test flight, MOL officially received the axe in June of 1969, leaving Skylab as the only space station left in development. Let's rewind a little on that development. Studies of S4B workshop designs took up much of the year 1965 at the Marshall Space Flight Center. The plan was to install the bare minimum amount of components inside the tank prior to launch, allowing the maximum amount of fuel to be spared for putting the craft into orbit. Many elements of von Braun's S2 wet lab proposal remained, such as the grated floor to allow fuel to flow through it. The airlock would be held in the area normally reserved for the Apollo lunar module, attached to the hydrogen tank. In the next year, the Marshall Space Flight Center sent out contracts to Douglas, Grumman, and McDonnell for converting an S4B into a wet workshop under the name Saturn S4B Spent Stage Experiment Support Module. In the same year, NASA astronauts began voicing concerns about a living space that had previously held hydrogen fuel, but their warnings fell upon largely deaf ears, as the wet workshop plan continued until 1968. By then, it had been announced that there would be only two aspects of the AAP to survive this era of continuously shrinking budgets: the orbital workshop and the Apollo Telescope Mount Solar Observatory, both of which would be incorporated into Skylab's design. Meanwhile, Project Apollo was proceeding far more smoothly than had been expected. The success of Apollo 8 had resulted in the cancellation of the E-type mission, which would have involved flying the entire Apollo spacecraft configuration into a high Earth orbit as a test run for flying around the Moon. This, as well as the eventual cancellations of Apollo 18 through 20, would free up more Saturn V boosters for use by the AAP. While this would have been ideal for von Braun's S2-based wet lab design, by now a large amount of funding and R&D had been put into the S4B design, and so this latter design was given the most focus. At the same time, the wet lab idea was based on a launch using the Saturn 1B, and with the extra power of the full Saturn V for launch, this was no longer necessary. The station could now be launched as a dry workshop, with its interior already fully prepared, directly into orbit by the S1C and S2 stages of the rocket. With the basis for the orbiting laboratory now finalized, work began on the more minute details of what Skylab would end up looking like. Now being a dry workshop, a lot more attention could be given to the plans for the interior of the station. Designers Raymond Loewy and William Snaith wanted to emphasize making it a pleasant place to live, as astronauts could be spending up to 3 months at a time confined to this workshop. Early spacecraft from Mercury to Gemini to Apollo were designed to be operated, not lived in, even though Apollo crews did spend nearly a full week confined to the command module. Skylab needed to be, quote, better than a boiler room, said George Mueller, associate administrator at NASA. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell had described their 14-day aboard Gemini 7 as a test of endurance, making it through on sheer motivation after accomplishing the mission's primary goal of orbital rendezvous. Skylab would change this by having a dedicated crew quarters, a place to take meals, sleep, and relax. Originally planning to use fabric curtains to subdivide the workshop, this idea was eventually dropped in favor of metal partitions instead, fabricated out of aluminum and installed before launch. A ventilation system was also installed, with the crew installing circulation fans upon arrival. Upon seeing a mock-up of the proposed design, Mueller was appalled by the barren mechanical nature of the interior. Nobody could have lived in that thing for more than 2 months, he said of it later. They'd have gone stir-crazy. He made recommendations to bring in industrial design experts to give Skylab, quote, some reasonable degree of creature comfort. These experts pointed out various flaws in a 1968 formal report, stating that the overall cylindrical structure clashed with rectangular elements and triangular gridwork, the lighting was scattered and random, the colors were too dark, and much more. They recommended a neutral background of pale yellow and reorganized the lighting to give the workshop a more welcoming presence, as well as assist with identifying equipment. All of these suggestions were received by the Marshall Space Flight Center with a degree of confusion, noting that Douglas was an experienced designer of commercial aircraft and felt that they should have tended to these concerns. Much of the difficulties in aesthetic design arose from the limitations of the wet workshop concept, and after this was changed to a dry workshop, it seemed much could be done to improve. A month after the change, Marshall described the layout as looking like a canvas tent city, stating that the floor plan made no sense, the food management compartment was too small, the sleeping compartments too large. It had none of the restrictions of Apollo, and yet, quote, an austere design persists. The astronauts, on the other hand, seemed largely unconcerned, even disdainful of the attention given to amenities such as color schemes, wanting the station to be efficient first and foremost. Mueller, however, persisted that the recommendations of the experts were important not only to the astronauts, but to the public image of the space program that would be formed when watching Skylab operations on TV transmissions. He also saw Skylab as something of a test run for future long-duration spacecraft, believing habitability to be a key and wholly underlooked element. The wardroom, essentially a crew quarters, initially had no window, and the industrial design experts described this decision as unthinkable, stating that it had enormous recreational value that would be more than worth its cost on a long-duration mission. Upon hearing this, Mueller turned to an associate and said simply, "Put in a window." Overall, Skylab would have 4 porthole-style windows, in addition to the small window provided on the EVA hatch. About that EVA hatch. Take a look at this thing. installed on the Skylab airlock module. It looks a little out of place, doesn't it? In fact, it almost looks like it belongs on a completely different spacecraft, because it does. That is the hatch of a Gemini spacecraft, used for external access to Skylab during spacewalks. Why is it there? Well, this is a clever little bit of sleight of hand that NASA performed to keep those who funded the project happy. Remember that Skylab was designed in an era of severely diminishing budgets, and cutting costs was the order of the day. What's one way to cut costs, or at least appear that you're cutting costs? Reuse of old hardware. This is something NASA continues to do to this day. The Space Launch System used for the Artemis program makes use of the same RS-25 engines designed for the 1970s-era space shuttle, the same solid rocket boosters from the shuttle though with an added segment for a longer burn time, and the same hypergolic AJ-10 engine that the shuttle used for its orbital maneuvering systems engines, which is also the same engine the Apollo service propulsion system was derived from, tracing its roots all the way back to Vanguard, one of the first US space rockets to ever exist. When it came to Skylab, NASA wanted to present to the public and to Congress that they were doing their best to cut costs on this fancy new space station. One way they did this was by installing the Gemini hatch onto the airlock module. See, we're even using an old hatch, they said publicly. However, internally, use of the hatch was not a cost-saving measure. First off, the Skylab airlock module is a cylinder, and the Gemini hatch was designed to fit onto a conical spacecraft. Significant work was needed to make it fit on the airlock, as well as to find an appropriate place to put it in the first place. Just by looking at it, you can sort of tell that it was shoehorned into the design. However, it kept the pencil pushers in Washington happy, which was the only thing it was designed to do in the first place. Back on the subject of crew comfort, Marshall was content to allow the astronauts to have their choice for personal entertainment and recreation. Designer Caldwell Johnson proposed an entertainment center for the wardroom to show movies or play music, but the astronauts weren't particularly enthused, nor were they by suggestions of card or board games. The crews preferred to simply read books or play recorded music on private tape players, as music tastes between crew members varied wildly. Aside from that, another primary source of astronaut entertainment had already been incorporated into the design: looking out the window. What about hygiene? You may be wondering how astronauts kept themselves clean in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo eras. The answer is, they didn't. Missions generally weren't long enough for a lack of showering to cause any serious health concerns, so the best they could do, even on Apollo missions, was to take a quick sponge bath. Initially, Houston's medical experts believed that this was all that would be required on Skylab as well, but Mueller disagreed, wanting to provide some way for the crew to take a proper shower. A concept, lightweight, low-cost, full-body shower was designed, as much as a proof of concept as it was for actual use, costing around $3 million in 1969. The shower ended up being used on all 3 crewed flights of Skylab, but it received mixed reviews from the astronauts. We'll come back to that. Many aspects of Skylab's habitability were simply unknowns. The entire project was unprecedented at the time, being planned to be the longest duration missions in history. The only analog Marshall could think of for comparison were submarines, but astronaut Paul Weitz received little to no useful information from the Navy, apart from a few figures for optimum light and maximum noise limits. Swiss scientist and engineer Jacques Piccard spent 31 days aboard a 6-man sub called the Ben Franklin, taking note of every complaint logged by the crew regarding the living conditions. He came to few conclusions that hadn't already been drawn. Next we come to the subject of space food. From an extremely informative NASA document titled Living and Working in Space, quote, "Nothing gave the workshop developers more trouble than the human digestive tract. Mercury to Apollo pioneered the processed, compressed, freeze-dried world of space food, and while not particularly tasty, was designed to fulfill the basic nutrition requirements of short-duration missions." Before liftoff, the astronauts could enjoy some hearty steak and eggs in the spirit of Alan Shepard's first flight, and after returning home, could recuperate any nutritional losses with a few home-cooked meals. While the crews didn't complain very often about their food options in those programs, there were occasional grievances.
I got the forks again. I've got them again, Charlie. I haven't eaten this much citrus fruit in 20 years. And I'll tell you one thing. In another 12 days, I ain't never eaten any more.
Orion, Houston.
Yes, sir. Okay, Don, where you have my hot mic? How long we had that?
After Don Arabian agreed to subsist on Apollo food for 4 days and found the experience extremely disagreeable, the AAP made a point of re-evaluating space food for Skylab and its long-duration stays. Medical experts on Gemini and Apollo noted weightlessness caused loss of calcium from bones and nitrogen from muscle, not enough to matter on those short flights, but Skylab missions would be much longer. In addition, the question of comfort again had to be considered. Arabian noted that by his 3rd day on the Apollo diet, he felt no excitement or anticipation for preparing food, mostly due to the lack of scents to stimulate the appetite and textures with which to enjoy eating. It was decided that the Skylab diet, in addition to the benefits of long-lasting and easy-to-store traditional space food, would provide some of the amenities of normal dining. Frozen dinners, freeze-dried camping foods, and possibly fresh fruits and vegetables, weight requirements be damned. This wasn't entirely unheard of at the time. The crew of Apollo 8 had enjoyed a Christmas dinner of hot turkey and gravy eaten with a spoon, which had helped immensely with the morale of the mission. Throughout 1969 and 1970, Skylab continued to have small changes and adjustments made to its design, refining what was likely to be the only crewed space program for quite some time, as development of the space shuttle was already known to be a very lengthy process. We'll come back to that. Experiments were outlined, ranging from food to the much more important medical experiments, as a primary goal of Skylab had always been to evaluate long-term health in microgravity. At the time, many at NASA were still hopeful that the 1980s or 1990s would see crewed missions to Mars, so spending 3 months in Skylab could be seen as a practice run for spending 3 months in deep space aboard a Mars transfer vehicle. As a result, Skylab missions wanted to evaluate everything that might matter for such a situation: crew health, morale, the ability to perform science over long durations, and much more. Such as, one last thing we'll mention before we finally move on to the actual construction: the space toilet. Fair warning, if you're eating right now or simply a little squeamish, here's a time code to skip past this messy section of the video. There was a lot to be considered on this subject. Previous missions were concerned only with collecting and disposing of body waste in a sanitary manner. This was why Apollo astronauts pooped in bags and wore diapers after Alan Shepard was forced to urinate in his suit on the first crewed American spaceflight. It was simple, but effective. Skylab, however, was very concerned with body waste for the purposes of their medical experiments. Body waste can tell a lot about the dietary conditions of those who excrete it, so the design of Skylab's toilet had to take into account a way to measure and return both urine and feces for analysis. NASA had 2 options available to them. One system, developed by the Fairchild-Hiller Corporation, which had originally been designed for use on the MOL. The other, designed by General Electric, was designed for the biosatellite program, in which the test subject was a 15-pound monkey. GE's system was able to measure the waste more accurately, but in the end, Marshall went with the advice of McDonnell Douglas and adopted the Fairchild-Hiller system for the primary reason that it would work better for the crew. Again, creature comforts on Skylab were considered very important. One unique aspect of Skylab is that, unlike most programs, it was never test flown. It couldn't be. Skylab was one of a kind, and there could be no preliminary flights to discover and correct design efficiencies. It had to be one of those situations where you do your absolute best to account for the unaccountable, then hope the unaccountable doesn't happen. It would happen, by the way, but we're not quite there yet. It helped immensely that many aspects were already flight-proven, in particular the S4B itself, but many other aspects were not, such as the Apollo telescope mount. Much of these went through testing in thermal vacuum chambers and with vibration tests, again such as the telescope mount, but this kind of testing can only tell the engineers so much. Skylab would very much be a wait-and-see type of operation, and boy, would they ever see. On August 8, 1969, McDonnell Douglas officially received the contract to convert 2 surplus S4B stages into Skylab workshops. One of these, Skylab B, would remain in storage and existed for concepts to expand the Apollo-Soyuz test project by connecting it with the Soviet Salyut space station, but these plans would end up being discarded after the primary Skylab was launched. Its various modules are currently on display in several different museums, with the workshop in the National Air and Space Museum, the airlock module in Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum, and the docking adapter at the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex. Both Skylab modules were constructed throughout 1969 and 1970, in pieces, being moved from McDonnell Douglas Astronautics Eastern and Western Divisions, then being slowly compiled and moved to the Marshall Space Flight Center for testing and final assembly. The airlock and multiple docking adapter were essentially 2 components of a single module, but these 2 components were built by separate contractors. As a result, before being shipped to KSC, the 2 were joined and tested as a single unit by Martin Marietta and McDonnell Douglas's Eastern Division of St. Louis. In 1971 and 1972, these pieces were finally in Houston for vibration testing and then thermal vacuum testing. The Skylab workshop was constructed at the McDonnell Douglas Huntington Beach facility in California beginning in April of 1969 when S4B number 212 was taken out of storage and started to be modified for its new role. This work took a significant amount of time due to Skylab's design being continuously altered after review, and by mid-1971, McDonnell Douglas fell under intense scrutiny from NASA. Uneasy about the contractor's slow progress, the Marshall Project Office cited inefficient management, questionable engineering practices, a poor ability to forecast schedules, and a bad arrangement of its upper management. After conferring, Marshall appointed a 24-person orbital workshop task team intending to provide a more effective interface between NASA and McDonnell Douglas and put the project back on track. The team included Skylab project managers, astronauts, McDonnell Douglas employees, and others, meeting weekly to discuss the progress and block out future work. They found the primary problems to be a slow trickle-down of information when the thousands of individual parts arrived, were tested, and failed or needed redesign, as well as a lack of integrated scheduling for the flow of these components. By mid-October, the situation seemed to have been improved, but the workshop was still very behind schedule compared to other components. While the airlock and docking adapter had passed 70% and 85% of their qualification tests respectively, the workshop's record at Skylab's midterm review was only 25% completion. However, in the early months of 1972, the checkout program was getting underway, and Marshall was looking forward to crewmen going through the workshop top to bottom to iron out final problems. By July 17th, after 510 hours of testing, the workshop was completed, with only a few anomalies discovered and dealt with. On the 8th of September, the workshop departed on a 13-day trip via the Panama Canal to Florida for a few final odds and ends, which were completed at the Cape. The Apollo telescope mount was the one major component of which construction was most closely managed directly by the Marshall Space Flight Center. The various components were constructed by subcontractors, such as the Harvard College Observatory, the Naval Research Laboratory, and others, but they were all then shipped to Marshall and assembled and tested there. I've talked about this briefly in a different video, but the plan for exactly how the telescope, always intended to be a solar observatory, would function changed over the years. Conceptualized under the name Advanced Orbiting Solar Observatory, it even began construction in 1964, was cancelled the next year, then given new life under the Apollo Applications Program. One original design worked by modifying an Apollo lunar module ascent stage into an observatory, while the crew who operated it would live in a docked Apollo CSM. Another idea involved having a LEM telescope as a free-flying unit, capable of operating with or without crew, detaching from Skylab, whatever that station would end up being, and performing observations with higher pointing accuracy and increased stabilization periods when not docked to the station. Once the dry workshop S4B layout of Skylab had been finalized, what remained of the observatory concepts was the Apollo telescope mount, no longer needing to be launched as a separate unit. It would now be constructed and attached to the workshop via the multiple docking adapter, and despite no longer being built out of an Apollo LEM, it would be the only part of the entire AAP to retain the Apollo name. In January of 1971, NASA's crew selection process changed dramatically. The original 7 astronauts of Project Mercury were all military test pilots, and one of those astronauts, Deke Slayton, who had been medically grounded and never flew a Mercury flight, was in charge of crew selection as Director of Flight Crew Operations. Slayton favored the test pilots, putting a premium on experience that allowed many Gemini astronauts to graduate to the Apollo program. However, around the time of the first lunar landings, Slayton's decision-making fell under scrutiny from the second category of astronauts, scientists. As most of those entered the program in 1965 and 1967, many didn't have the experience Slayton gave prominence to, putting them last in line for Gemini and Apollo, especially because many needed to spend a year gaining required Air Force flight training. The scientist astronauts became especially aggravated after the landing of Apollo 11. There was speculation that subsequent missions would feature more scientists, but Slayton chose all pilots for the next 3 landings. They brought their complaints to NASA headquarters, while Slayton rebutted that the hazards of lunar missions required experience and level-headedness of test pilots and, in his words, no one would benefit from a dead geologist on the moon. By January of 1970, NASA had canceled one Apollo flight, and in September another. Opportunities for the scientist astronauts were declining further. By the end of Apollo, only one scientist would ever walk on the moon, being geologist Jack Schmitt on Apollo 17. The astronauts again brought their grievances to the table, recommending headquarters establish new criteria for crew selection and that each Skylab mission should include 2 scientists. One noted that in the case of this new space station, quote, flight operations take only a small fraction of the time required for science and other objectives. Robert Gilruth and Slayton again pushed back against the recommendation of 2 scientists, arguing that hardware failures needed redundancy to combat, which would mean 2 pilots. They also pointed out that those being trained for Skylab were undergoing the maximum amount of cross-training, making each roughly the same level of proficient on major experiments regardless of academic background. In my completely unqualified opinion, I don't really like that Gilruth effectively said here that your multi-year doctoral degree is exactly as good as 10 weeks of Skylab training, but I am neither a pilot or a scientist, so take that as seriously as you'd like to. Crew selections were finalized and formally announced in January of 1972. Heading up the first two crews were Apollo veterans Charles Pete Conrad and Alan Bean, both of Apollo 12. Each crew would also include one scientist astronaut, a compromise the astronaut corps was forced to come to terms with. All three crews and their backups trained in a 1G simulator starting in October of 1970. Special focus was put on learning to use the Apollo telescope mount, and education into applications of solar physics, one of the workshop's primary experiments. A 2,200-hour training program was outlined, stretching over the course of 18 months and a 28-hour training week. This was a demanding schedule compared to Apollo training having an extra 1,000 hours attached to it. EVA training was done in Huntsville's Neutral Buoyancy Trainer, a precursor to the underwater ISS mock-up we know today. All of this training would be disrupted by simulator breakdowns, reviews, and last-minute changes suggested by the crews. By January of 1973, the first crew was behind schedule, causing their work week to be stretched to 60 hours. Delays in preparations at the Cape helped, pushing the launch of Skylab an extra 2 weeks, which was entirely consumed by training for the crews. However, by April 1973, everything was almost ready, and the Kennedy Space Center was preparing to roll the Skylab Saturn V out to Launch Complex 39A. The summer of 1972 created a buzz at the Kennedy Space Center that hadn't been felt since preparations for Apollo 11 were underway. In one high bay of the vehicle assembly bay stood the final Apollo Saturn V, the launch vehicle for Apollo 17. In the second bay, the Skylab Saturn V stood. In the third, a new 39-meter pedestal or milk stool that would facilitate the Saturn 1B Skylab launches was being completed, slightly altered from the Apollo-era milk stool. Workers had spent the last 2 years preparing and performing modifications on Launch Complex 39, then changing them again after Skylab officially became a dry workshop. Some of this work included modifying the Apollo White Room at the end of the crew access arm, replacing it with an airlock to protect the workshop's interior. Another aspect was ensuring access to the workshop and the rest of the stack for pad workers during preparation, most of which was done via that same airlock. By January of 1973, the newly modified launch complex was reviewed and certified, and it was time to officially get ready for launch. In May of 1973, the final moments of ground-based suspense for Skylab was brought by the weather. Heavy rains on May 4th revealed leaks in the payload shroud that surrounded the top of Skylab, and attempts to seal it were delayed by high winds and even more rain. On May 9th, the mobile launcher was struck by lightning, forcing a retest of all of the vehicle's systems. On launch day, shortly before liftoff time, Martin Marietta engineers saw one final oversight and corrected it, attaching a metal United States flag to the docking adapter. Then finally, at 1:30 p.m. on May 14th, Skylab and the final Saturn V roared off of the pad.
Continues to go smoothly. Guidance release, T-minus 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. We have ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And we have a liftoff. The Skylab lifting off the pad now, moving up. Skylab has cleared the tower.
Houston is now controlling. Mark, 18 seconds, pitch and roll program started. Saturn now maneuvering to its proper flight path attitude. Mark, 25 seconds. Mark, 30 seconds. 35 seconds, 1 nautical mile in altitude, looking good. Range safety, give Saturn a green, we've cleared the beach.
Disaster struck very quickly for what was going to be the only sustained crewed space mission for American spaceflight for a decade. 1 minute into the ascent, Skylab's micrometeoroid shield ripped off of the station, debris jamming one of the primary solar arrays and preventing it from deploying. This shield also served as the station's primary means of thermal control, meaning it was now exposed to the searing heat of the unfiltered sun. At the same time, the falling debris of the shield also damaged the pyrotechnics for the S2 interstage, a hollow ring designed to house the S2 engines. This ring was meant to fall away when these engines ignited, but remained in place, raising temperatures around the engine bay to dangerous levels. When the second stage finally shut down, mere seconds away from a launch abort, and Skylab separated from it, Retro rockets on the S-2 fired to push it away from the lab, and in doing so, tore one of the partially open solar panels completely off of it. Skylab was in a near-perfect circular orbit of 433 kilometers or 234 miles by 431 kilometers or 233 miles. However, in its current state, it was severely diminished in its power capabilities, and it was a lot warmer than it was supposed to be. As a result of this disastrous launch, Skylab 2, the first crewed mission to the station, had very suddenly changed its goals. Rather than the basics of getting the station back up and running and beginning to do scientific work, the primary mission was now to fix what had been broken. Skylab 2 was now a rescue mission. Program managers quickly delayed the first crew, intending for it to take place only 24 hours after Skylab reached orbit, first by 5 days, then by 5 more as the damage was analyzed and troubleshooting was performed. The crew, Pete Conrad, Paul Weitz, and Joseph Kerwin, flew back to Houston to begin training for their new mission. At the same time, an investigation board formed by Administrator James Fletcher began looking into the failure of the MMOD shield. It was determined that the shield's designers did not coordinate sufficiently with aerodynamics experts, and insufficient testing of the shield at simulated supersonic speeds contributed to the shield's failure. Once it was in orbit, Skylab was sent a series of commands over a half-hour period. First, it jettisoned a radiator cover that allowed its refrigerators to be switched on. Next, the 4-section payload shroud was deployed, peeling away and allowing for the telescope mount to move into its flight position. This was a crucial step, as it both allowed an Apollo spacecraft to dock with it and allowed the telescope mount's 4 solar wings to open. At this point, mission control mostly relaxed for a little while, as the only indication of the MMOD shield problem was a reading that suggested it had already been deployed. Assuming it was an instrumentation problem, mission control simply waited for the workshop solar arrays to deploy, scheduled for 41 minutes after launch. It was only about a half hour after Skylab had cleared the pad that everyone began to worry. Telemetry suggested that both solar wings had released for deployment, but were not fully extended.
Skylab Control Houston at 59 minutes ground elapsed time. We have no confirmation yet on the deployment of the airlock solar array system. We'll stand by and continue to monitor at 59 minutes ground elapsed time. This is Skylab Control Houston.
At the same time, temperature signals indicated that both wings were actually gone completely, and this was backed up by the lack of power being generated. If true, though it wasn't, this would mean that the workshop had lost nearly half of its electrical power. The ATM array provided about as much power as one of the workshop wings, around 5 kilowatts, and while the system had been designed with power to spare, this would mean most power would have to come from the fuel cells of visiting Apollo spacecraft. Most experiments would have to be curtailed, especially in the last week of each mission. Things were not looking good for Skylab, and they were barely even looking at the loss of the MMOD shield. It had failed to deploy at the correct time, and when a manual command was sent to deploy it, nothing happened. They weren't yet aware that the entire thing had been ripped off the station until flight engineers discovered flight data confirming an anomalous lateral acceleration that suggested a structural failure. Shortly afterwards, the workshop temperatures began to rise dramatically, and it became clear that they had 2 major problems on their hands. In terms of the overheating problem, Mission Control was focused on 2 things: reducing that heat and analyzing how bad the overheating actually was. It took some time to figure out the best orientation for Skylab. The best position for power generation put the ATM array directly facing the sun, but this also put the workshop directly facing the sun. For a time, the station was pointed with its forward end toward the sun, which did reduce overheating, but produced next to no power. The ideal position ended up being tilted up about 45 degrees toward the sun, the least loss of power and the most loss of heat. Moving the station into that ideal position involved the use of nitrogen gas thrusters, and there was only so much of that in supply. By the 17th of May, 23% of that supply was gone, twice the expected amount. Over time, the controllers became more adept at maneuvering the workshop around, but fuel consumption remained a concern. Worse, the measurement of this movement was done by 9 gyroscopes, several of which overheated and failed in the first day. Thankfully, at least 1 gyroscope in each axis of movement remained operational, allowing for relative accuracy in determining exactly where Skylab was at all times. In terms of how bad it was, the primary concern was consumables on board the station. With the workshop heating up, so were the food lockers inside of it, and teams were worried that a lot of it would end up spoiled. However, on the 22nd of May, Houston officials concluded that the food should actually be fine, but to be safe, also trained the crews with a course on food inspection. In addition to food, it was initially also believed that half of the 62 medications on board would also be ruined. During the following week, they became similarly optimistic, paring down the resupply list based on the results of heat tests on the ground. Another supply at risk was film. The The film for the solar telescopes was stored in the docking adapter, which was experiencing the opposite problem of excessive cooling, keeping the film safe. However, the film for other experiments was in the workshop, which continued to rapidly heat up. The problem also included dryness. Film needs some level of humidity to keep emulsion off of it, and the heat inside of Skylab was a very dry heat. It was believed the crews could restore the film by rehumidifying the vaults they were in, but this was a 20-day process, so there were also plans made to carry additional film on the crewed flights. The maneuvers that Skylab was making post-launch were a temporary solution. Of course, what they needed to do was devise some form of improvised sunshade for the workshop. This was less of an impossible task than it seemed. While the MMOD shield wrapped around the whole cylinder of the workshop, a sunshade didn't actually need to do that, as it only needed to cover the area that was directly facing the sun. Additionally, without any atmosphere to disturb it, it didn't exactly need to be bolted down to stay in place. Officials examined a wide range of ideas from spray paint to wallpaper to balloons, eventually emerging with 3 promising solutions. 1. Extend a shade from a pole attached to the telescope mount. 2. Deploy it from a maneuvering Apollo CSM. Or 3. Extend it through the scientific airlock on the workshop's sun-facing side. They first settled on the second option, as it seemed to have the best chance of meeting a May 20th launch date. However, concerns arose about such an early spacewalk in the mission, as well as possible contamination from the nitrogen thrusters of the Apollo spacecraft. The ideal option was a twin-pole sunshade deployed through the scientific airlock. Work proceeded to design a shade built out of mylar, nylon, and aluminum. At the same time, they also went to work devising tools for use to free the jammed solar panel, as telemetry data now suggested one was still available, but not deployed. At the time, they weren't even certain that they would be able to free it on this first flight, merely better assess the situation before getting it fixed on the second flight. Regardless, the plans to rescue Skylab were now in place, and Skylab 2 was ready for a May 25th launch. One more thing before we proceed to the crewed flights. There was a miscommunication regarding the number of these flights and their mission patches. Skylab 2 is the first crewed flight, Skylab 3 is the second, Skylab 4 the third. However, the mission patches each display numbers that, while making more sense, are technically inaccurate. Think of the patches as being one number too low.
We have launch commit and we have liftoff. The clock is running and Skylab has cleared the tower.
Tower in Houston, Skylab 2. We fix anything. We got a pitch and a roll program.
The thrust is going all engines.
Boy.
Despite a lightning strike that knocked a gyroscope offline, Skylab 2 lifted off the pad early in the morning with a near flawless ascent of the first Saturn 1B to launch in almost 5 years. By mid-afternoon, the crew had reached Skylab, performing a fly-around to assess the station's condition. Solar Wing 2 is gone completely off the bird, Pete Conrad reported. Solar Wing 1 is partially deployed, there's a bulge of micrometeoroid shield beneath it in the middle, and it looks to be holding it down. The crew also reported that the gold foil on the workshop's exterior had been blackened by the sun's rays, and the scientific airlock, thankfully, was virtually free of debris. Conrad was optimistic that a stand-up EVA could easily free the remaining solar wing. After eating dinner, before even docking to the station, the first attempt to extend the array was made. Paul White stood in the open hatch of the command module while Joseph Kerwin held his legs and Conrad operated the spacecraft. The attempt didn't go well. A metal strip had wrapped across the array beam, riveted in place by several bolts that had fastened themselves to the array when the shield tore away. Frustrated with their slow progress, the astronauts had to be reminded by Houston that they had resumed communication as they used some colorful language to vent their feelings on the situation. Deciding they were going to need some better tools, the crew gave up and decided to end the workday by docking. The crew had significant difficulties connecting their spacecraft to Skylab. The capture latches failed to operate 8 consecutive times, at which point the crew donned their pressure suits and partially disassembled the docking probe before putting it back together. The 9th attempt worked, and the crew came aboard in mid-afternoon of May 26th. Weitz reported that the workshop felt like a desert, the heat intense and dry, causing the astronauts to spend a lot of their time in the much cooler airlock, preparing a temporary sunshade parasol for deployment. They spent approximately 2 hours connecting the parasol canister to the scientific airlock and opening the port, threading the extension rods and gradually extending the parasol. Once they had the fabric spread out, the crew was disappointed that it wasn't, quote, laid out the way it was supposed to be, according to Conrad, covering only around 2/3 of the intended area. Mission Control, however, remained optimistic, expecting the material to stretch in the sunlight. Over the next 3 days, the workshop got considerably cooler, the external temperature dropping 55 degrees Celsius or 131 degrees Fahrenheit. The astronauts could even feel where the parasol was located by running their hands along the workshop wall and feeling for hot spots. Incidentally, one of these was very close to where one of the astronauts slept. By May 29th, the workshop was only 5 degrees warmer than it was supposed to be, and full-scale operations could begin with medical tests, solar observations, and preparations for the Earth resources observations. When operating the Apollo telescope mount, power consumption reached close to Skylab's limit of 4.5 kilowatts. Furthermore, the Earth resources maneuver required taking the solar panels out of direct sunlight and relying on the batteries, 4 of which dropped offline on the dark side of the Earth. With the workshop returned to its solar-facing attitude, Mission Control was only able to bring 3 of them back online. The loss quickly prompted a discussion of freeing the trapped solar wing, with the 4th of June set as the date for a decision. Mission Control devised a difficult but feasible EVA plan, relaying this to the crew. Conrad and Kerwin exited the airlock hatch on the morning of June 7th in the dark. The operation was difficult, differing in many ways from the plan Huntsville devised. The astronauts had to hold on to an antenna boom as a handhold, while using an 8-meter cable cutter on the debris with one hand. In the training simulation, astronauts were able to place their feet at the base of the antenna, but on the flight model, cable connectors were in the way, and their feet had to float free. According to Kerwin, quote, "One hand was essentially useless, wrapped up around the antenna, and with the other hand I couldn't control the pole. Every time you would move it, your body would react and move the other way." Every time he got the cable cutter close to the debris, the pole would move as he brought his hand off the antenna to open the jaws of the cutter. They struggled again to get both hooks of an erection tether secured to the array, and when they finally did get the array deployed, both astronauts were heaving with all of their might as it suddenly let go and flung them both away from the workshop. For a brief moment, the strength of their tethers, as well as the strength of their hearts, were put to the test. By the next day, the solar wing was fully extended and producing nearly 7 kilowatts of additional power. The crew spent almost another month making further repairs to the workshop, as well as conducting a grand total of 392 hours of onboard experiments. They tracked 2 minutes of a large solar flare with the ATM, returned some 29,000 frames of film of the sun, and doubled the previous record for time spent in space. On June 22, 1973, Skylab 2 finally splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, the mission having lasted 28 days, 49 minutes, and 49 seconds. NASA faced some pretty intense scrutiny following the landing of Skylab 2. One of the issues was that of private communication. Since its inception, NASA had prided itself on being open about the space program, which was in sharp contrast to the secrecy of the Soviet Union's space program. However, in the late 1960s, a private conversation from the Apollo 9 mission was seen by the press as a move away from the open policy, with the Houston Post even arguing that the public had a right to know about the medical information of the astronauts. With Skylab, this went even further, the unique medical requirements of the program establishing a proposal for private medical conversations on a daily basis, which would be summarized briefly for the press. There were also provisions for the astronauts to make unmonitored calls to their families. At the same time, there was concern within NASA that privacy would strain public relations and therefore threaten the remaining Skylab missions. Further tensions came in the form of the medical experiments. Essentially, NASA wanted strict control of all exercise before and during a mission for the purposes of obtaining carefully calculated results. Astronauts objected to this because of the extreme personal inconvenience, as well as a belief that they could judge their need for exercise on their own better than a doctor on the ground could. A compromise was eventually reached. The regulations were relaxed, but astronauts were required to keep careful records of their exercise to ensure accurate data for analysis later. The first crew was allowed, by the flight plan, 30 minutes a day for exercise on either the ergometer, basically a zero-G exercise bike, or an isometric device, such as lifting dumbbells. On Weiss's first run of the exercise bike, Kerwin had recommended he shorten the exercise due to the heat in the workshop. Houston told them that he should attempt the full exercise, but halfway through, Weiss called it quits, due to both the heat and the restrictions of the waist and shoulder harness. He stated that he was doing too much work with his hands, rather than with his legs as the exercise intended. Overall, many of the medical results from this first mission seemed largely inconclusive. The astronauts were also not a fan of the flight planning schedule. They found it too demanding, as many tasks ended up taking longer in a real weightless environment than they had on ground simulators. They quickly fell behind schedule, and after the second day, Conrad concluded that the schedule was unrealistic. Quote, "We were trying to do it all, and were getting inefficient by rushing." He informed Mission Control that the crew was, quote, "running all over the spacecraft," and that there were, quote, "enough guys down there to think out the flight plan a little better than you're doing." The astronauts gave the food on Skylab a barely passing grade. The station itself was livable and made an adequate home, but they all stated they could not recommend it as a restaurant. Food seemed to lose its flavor, tasting worse than the same foods had back on the ground. White stated, quote, "The foods I liked I continued to like. The foods I didn't like, my dislike for them increased. A taste for spicy food was dulled by head congestion, a result of blood pooling in the upper regions of the body while in microgravity, and frozen foods were rated higher than reconstituted ones." Conrad stated, quote, "I found that if I reconstituted the peas, the beans, and the asparagus early and then reheated them, I still didn't like them, but they were a lot easier to choke down than when I added the hot water, shook up the bag, and then tried to get them down." Despite everything, the crew stated they enjoyed the flight, commenting on the remarkable view and the incredible acrobatics they were able to perform in the large, weightless environment. Conrad even pointed out that he enjoyed one particular aspect of the mission's final spacewalk. A secondary objective had been to try and reactivate one of the dead power modules by quite literally whacking its housing with a hammer. The plan had worked. Within minutes, electricity was flowing again. The overall success of this mission, as well as the failures of the batteries and the gyroscopes, prompted NASA to push the launch of Skylab 3, the second crew, by 3 weeks, set for July 28, 1973. Its crew was Alan Bean, Owen Garriott, and Jack Luzma, and would be the final Skylab crew to be commanded by a veteran of the Apollo program. It lifted off entirely on schedule and was placed into a parking orbit without any difficulties.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. We have ignition sequence start. All ignitions are running. All engines running. We have a liftoff. And the second man crew has cleared the tower.
Rolling pitch program, Houston.
Roger, rolling pitch, Skylab, and thrust looks good on all engines.
Skylab 3's flawless nature did not last for very long. While approaching the station for docking, a propellant leak developed in one of the Apollo spacecraft's 4 blocks of reaction control system thrusters. Despite this, the crew was able to safely dock to the station while troubleshooting continued with the leak. 6 days later, a second thruster block developed a leak, and now it was deemed to be a potentially serious problem. For the first and only time in the program, a Skylab rescue mission was considered, even rolling out the Saturn 1B reserved for it to Launch Complex 39 in preparation. The Skylab rescue scenario is somewhat fascinating in and of itself. Skylab was capable of having 2 Apollo spacecraft docked to it at one time, so the plan was to launch a second CSM that had been heavily modified. By removing the capsule's storage lockers, 2 extra seats could be fitted below the main 3, allowing the spacecraft to launch with 2 astronauts and return with 5. It wasn't an entirely new idea. In fact, it had been originally conceived in 1965 by North American Rockwell as a method to rescue Apollo astronauts who wound up stranded in lunar orbit. The plan wasn't without concerns. The primary one was the 3 upper seats collapsing onto the lower seats and crushing the astronauts in a rough landing, even though the seats had never budged at all on any previous missions. Despite the plan and the rocket being in place, the rescue mission never needed to be launched. It was eventually determined that the Apollo spacecraft could safely maneuver itself with the 2 remaining thruster blocks, and the Skylab 3 mission continued as planned while the rescue launch vehicle was rolled back indoors. Skylab 3 experienced a different, almost unprecedented problem: space adaptation syndrome. Basically the microgravity equivalent of motion sickness, space adaptation syndrome is caused by the human body struggling to overcome the unusual feeling of being weightless. At this point, the malady was somewhat poorly understood, as the first 19 Americans to go to space had not been affected by it. Almost half of the Soviet cosmonauts of the Vostok and Voskhod programs had been affected, but this was the era of the Cold War, and the Reds weren't sharing their information about it. However, once Apollo began, American immunity ended, affecting 9 of the 29 astronauts who flew in it with nausea and vomiting, persisting for several days in some cases. With Skylab 3, the first signs of illness appeared less than half an hour after launch, and by their first evening aboard the workshop, all 3 men were suffering greatly from motion sickness, with Luzma getting it the worst. By the next morning, there was no improvement. The crew was only able to eat half of their breakfast, and Bean reported, quote, "Although we're moving around getting things done, we're not doing them as rapidly as we'd like." Despite requests to take the day off for recovery, Houston agreed only to a mid-afternoon rest before attempting to resolve an electrical problem in the workshop. By that evening, the crew was a full day behind schedule, and NASA officials postponed the first planned EVA for at least one day. By the third day aboard, the worst of it was over, but trouble getting the workshop fully activated kept them behind schedule. "We seem to end up with about as many new chores as old," Bean said. "We're having difficulty progressing because we're doing other work." 6 hours have been lost troubleshooting the workshop's dehumidifier and its urine separator. The hectic schedule was further compounding their recovery from space sickness, but they did all feel much better by the 1st of August. Houston, however, remained worried. This was the first time they had an entire crew affected by space adaptation syndrome, and were greatly concerned about the impact it might have on future missions. Moving forward, prevention and treatment of motion sickness became a top priority. Skylab 3 performed 3 spacewalks. The twin-pole sunshade, a more permanent solution to the slowly degrading parasol that already covered the workshop, had already been brought aboard by the previous crew. However, Mission Control hadn't wanted to subject that already strained crew to a third EVA, and it was left for the second crew. The plan was established on the ground and practiced in Huntsville's water tank. The two 17.5-meter poles were in 11 different sections, and Gary had assembled them from just outside the airlock hatch. Meanwhile, Luzma secured foot restraints and the shade's base plate to the ATM truss segment. After pole assembly, Luzma attached them to the base plate in a V shape, then fastened the sail to rope that ran along the length of the poles. Finally, he hoisted the shade while Bean monitored the operation from the docking adapter. This work was not without its hitches. It took longer than expected to assemble the poles until Gary had repositioned himself and went at it from another angle. Hoisting the sail found folds that prevented the material from straightening out at once, but the sun rays eventually softened it up, and the sail opened. Despite the operation taking nearly 4 hours, the crew seemed happy, enjoying the exercise before going to replace film for the Apollo telescope mount and retrieve experiment samples. The entire spacewalk took 6.5 hours, the longest ever performed at that time. With the workshop temperatures now fully under control and the space adaptation syndrome having faded away, the crew quickly got to work on solar viewing. On August 7th, Gary used the ATM to observe the sun's outer atmosphere for 3 hours. On the 9th, they photographed a medium-sized solar flare, and the next day an even larger flare was detected from the ground. The crew was informed and, refusing to take a full day of rest while they were behind schedule, cut their half-day short and quickly manned the telescopes. The observed solar event was described as one that only comes along 2 or 3 times a year, and the crew was lucky to capture it with this new advanced equipment. Solar viewing continued and increased during the next 10 days, reaching a peak of 14 man-hours on August 20th. The hydrogen alpha telescopes were used as a means to study and recognize the early stages of solar flares. The 2 weeks of work culminated the next day with a ground discovery of a huge solar prominence on the sun's eastern edge. While Alan Bean was observing it, he described it like a bubble on the edge of a disk. They watched the prominence, nearly 3/4 the size of the sun itself, arch outwards through the corona in a massive loop. The success of this part of the mission prompted a lot of media to compare the results with that of the first mission, which I think is a little unfair given how much time the first crew had to spend to simply get the workshop operational. In addition to a full week of Earth resource observations and many more medical experiments, Skylab 3 featured a few more interesting experiments. One of these was the S-150 X-ray experiment, a 1,360 kilogram or nearly 3,000 pound X-ray astronomy satellite. Sent up at the top of the S-4B behind the Apollo spacecraft, it flew behind and below Skylab itself and ran for 5 hours until its batteries ran out, allowing it to measure half of the visible sky. The data was recorded on tape and then transmitted to the ground. Another was the spiderweb experiment. 2 female European garden spiders named Arabella and Anita were sent up and placed in transparent boxes to observe their activities. Both took some time to adjust to their new weightless environment, but after 1 day, Arabella had spun a sufficient, though incomplete, web, finishing it the next day. The astronauts then gave the spiders water and a housefly, removed Arabella's first web, and waited for her to spin a new one. She did, this one more elaborate than the first, though both spiders eventually died during the mission, possibly from dehydration. After examining the webs, the most curious feature found was that they were not only spun from overall thinner silk, but also had variations in thickness throughout. On Earth, spider webs are observed to have a very uniform thickness, so this was seen as significant for the experiment. Skylab 3, throughout its 60-day duration, saw a host of mechanical problems. It seemed like Skylab was aging very quickly. The dehumidifier required daily servicing to keep it from leaking, even after Alan Bean spent an entire day disassembling and inspecting it. A mechanism for a stellar astronomy experiment jammed midway out of the airlock, and it wasn't able to be fixed until the following morning. Leaks in the coolant loops were a constant and more serious problem, as they were responsible for cooling electronic systems that included the controls for both the ATM and the Earth Resources package. Just 3 days prior to undocking, the crew performed a third and final EVA that Houston was reluctant to allow. Skylab's gyroscope problems had continued into this second mission, and while they were still able to maintain control of at least one gyroscope in all 3 axes of movement, there was worry about what would happen if one were to fail. In preparation, a 6-pack of more gyroscopes were brought with the crew of Skylab 3, intended for installation on an experiment rack in the docking adapter. After 2.5 hours, Skylab now had 9 good rate gyroscopes, employing the standard redundancy procedures originally planned for the mission.
And for the CDR and telemetry, a 6-pack is looking good. The gyros are matching each other.
Good news, and now I'm going to power up the CMG again.
Overall, despite the slow start due to space sickness, Skylab 3 was an extremely efficient mission. After their recovery, the crew settled into a very regular routine and very quickly caught up with all of the time that they had lost. They didn't bother with the shower as the first crew did. Setting up and using it was an hour-long procedure, so they opted instead for a daily scrubbing with washcloths. The crew were seen as something of overachievers. We decided that we weren't going home without doing 100% and more if possible, Luzma recalled later. In early September, Alan Bean actually asked for a week or more extension of the mission, which was turned down. By the end, Mission Control was actually having a hard time finding enough work for the crew to do, and the crew brought suggestions for new experiments to fill the spare time during their post-flight briefing. Skylab 3 splashed down safely on September 25, 1973, again breaking records for time spent in space. The crew had orbited the Earth a total of 858 times. Only one mission remained at this point. While the second crew was setting new records, the third crew was training and preparing. This final crew, all rookies, consisted of Gerald Carr, Edward Gibson, and William Pogue. A number of last-minute changes have been made to this flight plan. With the unexpected success of the second mission, more experiments and tasks have been devised for the third, but the funny thing about planning is, it doesn't always go according to plan. The crew would later complain that the training for a lot of these additional tasks have been wholly inadequate.
Continuing to go smoothly, T-minus 13. We'll look for an ignition at T-minus 2.1 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. We have a liftoff. Liftoff, the engine's building up to 1.6 million pounds of thrust, and Skylab is moving slowly off the pad. It's cleared the tower.
Skylab 4 lifted off at 9:01 a.m. on November 16, 1973. Ascent and orbital insertion was nominal, with no major events. This was good given that their Saturn 1B launch vehicle had to have its aerodynamic fins replaced on the launch pad after they were found to be cracked. The spacecraft docked with Skylab almost exactly 8 hours into the flight, and around this time, the all-rookie crew made a serious error in judgment. Knowing the strain that space adaptation syndrome had placed on Skylab 3, they decided not to tell Mission Control that William Pogue asked to be handed a vomit bag. He tried to, quote, go slow for a few minutes, as he put it, but ended up vomiting into the bag anyway. While they were out of radio range, the other two debated about whether or not to say anything, decided to not, and say that Pogue was not hungry for their first meal, hence the food he didn't consume. When Houston returned, Gerald Carr asked to postpone their evening status report because they hadn't started eating yet. Houston agreed, giving them 2 more hours to decide what to do. What they forgot was that an onboard tape recorder had been running the entire time, and the data was periodically transmitted back to the ground. On the second morning, they all felt much better, even Pogue, though he still decided to take things easy for a little while. After eating breakfast and watching the Alps through the windows, they were ready to enter the workshop, and by 9:15, they had begun powering up the station for use. They had an initial shock once getting aboard, discovering that, on the dark and dingy station, there appeared to already be someone aboard. However, it took only a second glance to realize that these were dummies, left by the previous crew as a practical joke, even dressed up in the clothes intended for the third crew. Toward the end of the day, they were contacted by Mission Control, who handed the microphone to the chief of the astronaut office, Alan Shepard, the first American in space. "I just wanted to tell you," he said, "that on the matter of your status reports, we think you made a fairly serious error in judgment here in the report of your condition." Carr, realizing that there was no further squirming around, simply said, "Okay, Al, I agree with you. It was a dumb decision." The situation ended there, though reporters began to speculate about a breakdown in communications between crew and ground teams. Skylab 4 was now being carefully watched for any further signs of insubordination. Activation became the order of the day moving forward. This took more time than it had with the other crews, due largely to this crew's rookie status. Mistakes slowed them down significantly, such as an hour lost when Pogue left a valve in the wrong position while flushing the potable water system, accidentally dumping disinfectant into the waste tank. By the end of the first day, the crew was 2 hours behind, a deficit they didn't end up reducing. The next day was dedicated to recharging the coolant loops that cooled the spacesuits and airlock batteries, permitting the first spacewalk to be conducted on time. This job was carried out without any trouble and on time by Pogue, who had now fully recovered from his space adaptation syndrome. The coolant recharge was one of several extra chores assigned to the crew in this first week. New medical experiments included girth measurements at 50 different points on the astronauts' bodies, showing how blood and other body fluids tended to move upwards towards the head in microgravity. These measurements took 4 hours to complete, as the tapes were hard to handle and the crew had no training with them whatsoever. A secondary aspect involved photographs taken on infrared-sensitive film, and the photographer found it difficult to remain still while taking the photos, ending up wedging his shoe between 2 water tanks. This ended up accidentally turning a valve, the loss of pressure in the tank not discovered until later that night. On the 22nd of November, Thanksgiving Day, the first spacewalk was scheduled. Tasks included reloading the ATM cameras, as well as checking out a non-operating antenna on the microwave sensor. Gibson and Pogue suited up and exited the airlock just before noon, and Pogue undertook his first task of photographing the amount of contamination surrounding the workshop. He managed only a few photos before the camera failed, the shutter knob spinning ineffectively in his gloved fingers. Struggling with restraints while checking the bad antenna, they ended up making it a 2-man job. Gibson, better able to restrain himself, held onto Pogue's suit and moved him around, while Pogue called out directions and kept both hands free to do his work. After determining that the antenna's problem lie in his pitch circuit, all they were able to do was install a pin to lock the pitch gimbal, then use a jumper to bypass it. It worked afterwards, but only side to side, which was better than not working at all. The crew returned inside the airlock after a 6.5-hour near-flawless operation. Now, let's discuss the alleged Skylab 4 mutiny. This is a popular misconception about this final mission that, for some reason, persists to this day. The myth goes as follows. During Skylab 4, the crew, upset with how overworked and pushed by Mission Control they were, decided on one day to shut off their radio, not respond to any requests, and simply take the day off. However, the truth of the matter isn't quite as interesting. The crew certainly was overworked, that much is true, and we've already discussed why. Additional tasks laid onto a rookie crew, believing them to somehow be able to exceed the work of a crew led by an Apollo veteran. To make up for their slow progress, the crew made a decision to have their daily morning briefing be attended by only one astronaut, leaving the others free to continue working while the third would inform them of the briefing later. However, on one of these mornings, the tired mission commander Gerald Carr simply forgot to turn on his radio, leaving Skylab out of contact with the ground for exactly one orbit, roughly 90 minutes. By the time the station came back around, Carr had turned the radio back on and communication was reestablished. The mistake did, however, prompt a discussion with Mission Control that the crew called the first sensitivity training in space regarding their workload and their feelings about it. However, the mutiny story simply isn't true, a gross exaggeration perpetuated by an old newspaper article that took the truth, blew it way out of proportion, and was later accepted as truth in itself. By the end of its first month, Skylab 4 was being subjected to intense scrutiny from news reporters. They wanted to know why everything was moving so slowly and why the crew was making so many mistakes. The flight directors vehemently denied all of this, stating that there was no higher rate of mistakes than on any previous missions, and refused to compare the performances of the other crews. If anything, given the extra tasks and inexperience of the crew, they were right on schedule. Furthermore, the first day's medical omissions worsened media concerns, with some reporters calling it a cover-up. What else were the astronauts keeping from the flight directors, they wanted to know. The directors responded that the Channel B tapes were full of admissions of errors, and medical conferences since then had been honest and open. They reiterated that, even on the first day, the eventual decision had been made to let Mission Control know what happened, and they even saved the physical evidence. Top flight directors warmly defended the crew, and the reporters finally let the subject drop. If there was one major takeaway from Skylab's final mission, it was flight planning. On December 12th, William Pogue complained bitterly to Mission Control that the schedule for experiments was far too tight. He had lost a couple photographs that day because he had to set up a camera in a hurry, stating, "This is going to happen again and again until word gets through to the flight activities officers that they're going to have to give us some time to get from one point in the spacecraft to another. I don't know how we're going to get this across to them unless you, the principal investigators, put your foot down and stomp it hard." 2 days later, Gerald Carr effectively made the same complaint. On the 20th, Gibson took his turn with complaints about how his schedule had been ruined that morning by a series of small, time-consuming problems. "That's no way to do business," he stated. "I personally have found the time since we've been up here to be nothing but a 33-day fire drill. I've been engulfed in building blocks rather than being concerned with the quality of the data." He decided that his personal independence would take precedent over the rigid scheduling, stating that work done correctly was more important than work being done on time. The end of December was largely taken up by observations of the comet Kohoutek with the Apollo telescope mount, but afterwards Gerald Carr sent a 6-minute plea to Mission Control for a frank discussion regarding the strained status of the mission, that sensitivity training we talked about earlier. He wanted to know how far behind they were, how dissatisfied the ground teams were, if at all, and how best to move forward with a better understanding of the mission between the two teams. The resulting discussion the next day did exactly that. Mission Control was not, in fact, dissatisfied. They found no significant difference between the accomplishments of this crew and the last, and acknowledged the crew's request to relax the schedule in favor of more precise and more thorough work. After a 55-minute discussion, Administrator Truly expressed Mission Control's satisfaction. Quote, "Jerry, let me say one thing, that Dr. Kraft and Deke have been here and listened, and they're very happy with the way you're doing things, and they think we've made about $1 million tonight." After setting a third duration record for 84 days in space, Skylab 4 undocked from the station. They took several photos, including this most iconic image of Skylab that will always be the first result for any Google searches. Little did they know, they would be the final people to see the station in one piece. It would remain here, dormant, for 5 years, hoping for rescue that would never come. Skylab's story is almost over. Before they left the station, Gerald Carr used the Apollo spacecraft's RCS thrusters to push the station 11 kilometers higher than it had been, into a 433 by 455 kilometer orbit. Once the crew had splashed down, flight controllers vented the atmosphere and shut down most of its systems. There wasn't exactly an immediate plan to rescue her. NASA saw a 9-year lifespan for the aging laboratory to be sufficient, and with the problems with their gyroscopes and coolant loops, it seemed best to end the mission here. NASA had a new mission on their hands, one that would take an entire decade of development: the Space Shuttle. NASA crewed missions fell stagnant for some time. While the shuttle was being developed, the Soviets surpassed all of Skylab's endurance records with their own Salyut stations, and Soviet officials were speaking of establishing larger, more permanent space stations, and by 1986 would begin this with the Mir space station. NASA had been hoping, at least in some small part, that Skylab would remain in orbit until around 1983, and by then the shuttle would be operational. While it wasn't a major priority, there were discussions held about using the shuttle to boost Skylab's orbit and prepare it for a 4th or even 5th crew. Though they knew it likely wouldn't happen, the final crew had even left a bag filled with supplies to welcome any new visitors who might come, and even left the hatch unlocked. Solar activity through the mid-1970s heated and expanded the Earth's upper atmosphere, and began subjecting Skylab to far more aerodynamic drag than had originally been anticipated. It was not going to last until 1983. In March of 1977, the Marshall Space Flight Center asked NASA headquarters for permission to begin work on a mission to raise Skylab's orbit to extend its lifespan, giving NASA time to consider future uses for the aging station. Johnson Space Center informed NASA headquarters and Marshall that the earliest it could reboost, or deboost if necessary, Skylab would be September 1979, as part of the Space Shuttle's 5th orbital test flight. At the time, NASA envisioned 6 test flights before they could consider it operational. The decision of whether or not to revive or destroy Skylab would be determined by its status at that time. It was believed that its main solar wing and subsequent batteries would probably still be usable, but the batteries for the Apollo telescope mount wouldn't be, having frozen in the station's dormancy. The cooling system was rapidly decaying, the guidance computer was probably dead after heating up and cooling down through so many orbits, the gyroscopes were on the constant verge of failure. It was not looking good, but nevertheless, late in 1977, Marshall gave the go-ahead to make a plan for the reboost. While the shuttle would not be ready enough to dock with the station and reboost it that way, a secondary plan was made: the teleoperator retrieval system. Capable of being deployed from the shuttle's payload bay, this small boxy device would move in, dock with Skylab, and boost its orbit with 4 small engines while being operated remotely by the crew of the nearby space shuttle. Following this, the shuttle would launch Skylab refurbishment kits, extending its power and docking capabilities for further use. By the end of the 3rd phase of this Skylab refurbishment program, the station would look something like this. By December of 1978, dreams of reviving Skylab came to an end. The Space Shuttle main engine, known today as the RS-25, was proving extremely difficult to refine the design of. That year, 2 tests of the SSMEs resulted in explosive failures on the test stand, and it became clear that the shuttle was not going to be ready for a 1979 debut flight. It would, in fact, not make its first flight until 1981. Skylab was doomed, and focus was now placed on deorbiting it as safely as possible. Earlier in 1978, Skylab was put into the public spotlight again. That year, a Soviet spacecraft called Cosmos 954 had come down into the atmosphere and scattered its burnt remains over North Canada, including pieces of a nuclear-fueled power module. The public now became concerned about what would happen to Skylab when it came down, as its path went over about 90% of the world's population at one point or another. It would be a PR disaster if a piece of Skylab were to fall on a human being or their home. NASA focused on very slowly powering up Skylab's remaining operational batteries, using the spacecraft's attitude to attempt to control how much drag it was experiencing, and thereby more precisely control when and where it would come crashing down. Or so they hoped. In 1979, Skylab's impending demise became a worldwide media event. T-shirts were sold, bets were made on where she would come down, a neighborhood in Nebraska painted a large target on the ground to give the station something to aim for, and the San Francisco Examiner offered its $10,000 prize for the first piece of the station to be delivered to their offices. Of course, NASA was assuring the public that the station would land in the water, making the Examiner certain that the prize would never be paid. In its final week, NASA forecasted that the station would come down between July 10th and July 14th, putting the most likely date right in the middle on the 12th. Mere hours before re-entry began, they continued to adjust its orientation, aiming for a crash site 810 miles southeast of Cape Town, South Africa. Skylab re-entered Earth's atmosphere at 1637 UTC on July 11, 1979. It remained intact longer than predicted. Due to a 4% calculation error, it broke apart about 300 miles east of Perth, Western Australia, observed in the sky by Hugh Jarvis, a viewer of this channel, and falling in a largely unpopulated area. Australian residents and even an airline pilot watched the brightly burning pieces streak through the air, and finally, 24 pieces of it landed on the home of Stan Thornton, who quickly gathered it up and prepared to collect his prize money. Most of its oxygen tank landed in an empty field, was collected by the locals, and is now on display at a museum in Esperance, Australia. Other fragments were returned to the US, with large pieces now displayed at the US Space and Rocket Center. The Shire of Esperance issued a $400 littering fine to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It was never paid. With Skylab gone, NASA shifted its focus to Spacelab, a reusable orbital workshop stowed in the payload bay of the space shuttle. Later, once the Mir station established a precedent for large modular space stations, focus again shifted to Space Station Freedom, a concept that would eventually evolve into the International Space Station. Despite its flaws, Skylab was a valiant first effort at long-term spaceflight. It was rendered almost dead on arrival by its violent ride to orbit, repaired in space, broke records 3 times, and performed an unprecedented amount of scientific research into what living and working in space could be like. There's even a lot I cut out of this story for the sake of pacing and relevancy, so if you want more, I'll provide my resources in the description. Since Skylab fell to Earth, there hasn't been another US single-launch space station, with the ISS taking over for microgravity research from the late 1990s and continuing to this very day. However, much like Skylab, the ISS is getting old. The end of its life is now within sight as well, and while other modular stations are in the works, single-launch stations are now making something of a comeback. Starlab, a joint venture between Voyager Space and Airbus, is expected to launch no earlier than 2028 and harkens back to the old Skylab days in its aesthetics, though it plans to use an inflatable habitat module instead of a rigid one. Haven 1, however, developed by VAST, is a small rigid craft expected to launch a crew of 4 aboard a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft, aiming for a 2025 launch date. These and other similar commercial projects will be effectively rented by NASA, replacing the aging ISS to continue microgravity research for future deep space missions. The timeline of space stations is a curious one, and it's interesting to see that the single launch format of Skylab is no longer dead. In fact, it is very much alive, and this new era of low-orbit innovation has its roots in this old converted rocket stage that flew over our heads for 6.5 years. We will never forget you, Skylab, nor the ground you paved for us to walk our path through the cosmos. Farewell.